The thunderous pounding of hooves against the hard-packed earth echoed through the valley as Catherine O'Sullivan clung to the windowsill of her attic prison, straining to glimpse the rider approaching her family's sprawling ranch. For 3 months, the walls of this cramped space had been her world, a punishment for daring to challenge her uncle's authority over her inheritance and future. At 22, she was old enough to make her own decisions. But in 1878, Wyoming Territory, being a woman with property made her a target for those who claimed to protect her. The dust cloud following the lone horseman grew larger as he approached the main house. Catherine pressed her face against the iron bars her uncle had installed across the small window, her heart racing. She didn't recognize the stranger, but something about his determined posture gave her a flicker of hope, the first she'd felt since her Uncle Patrick had locked her away after her parents' funeral. "He won't stop," she whispered to herself, tucking a strand of copper hair behind her ear. "No one ever does." Yet the rider didn't pass by. He dismounted at the hitching post, his movements fluid and confident. Even from her high vantage point, Catherine could see he stood tall, his broad-shouldered frame draped in a worn duster, a Stetson pulled low over his face. A gun belt hung at his hip, not unusual in these parts, but he wore it with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Catherine's uncle emerged from the house, his stocky figure recognizable even from a distance. The conversation between the two men seemed tense, her uncle's arms gesticulating wildly while the stranger remained still, only occasionally nodding or speaking brief words that made Patrick's face grow redder. Then, to Catherine's surprise, the stranger removed his hat, revealing dark hair that caught the afternoon sun. He pointed directly up at her window, and for a brief, electric moment, Catherine was certain his eyes met hers. She jerked back instinctively, heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of heavy boots stomping up the stairs sent her scrambling away from the window. The bolt on her door slid open with a harsh scrape, and her uncle burst in, face mottled with rage. "What have you done, girl?" he demanded, crossing the room in 3 angry strides to grab her arm. "Who did you contact?" "No one," Catherine answered truthfully, trying to pull away. "I haven't been able to send word to anyone. You've made sure of that. Then why is there a man downstairs claiming to be Alexander Quinn, son of your father's business partner, asking for you specifically?" Patrick's fingers dug painfully into her flesh. "Says he's here to discuss your father's mining interests." Catherine's mind raced. Her father had mentioned a partner in his silver mining venture. Quinn was the name, but she'd never met the man or his family. Hope flared within her. Could this stranger be a legitimate connection to her father's business affairs? "I don't know him," she said carefully, "but if he knew father, perhaps I should speak with him." Patrick's laugh was cold. "You think I'm fool enough to let you near him? That mine is the only thing keeping this ranch afloat now that your parents are gone." His voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "Remember our arrangement, Catherine. You stay quiet about our little situation here, and your beloved younger sisters continue receiving the best care at that fancy school in Boston." Catherine felt the familiar weight of despair settle in her chest. Her uncle had made it clear from the beginning any attempt to regain control of her inheritance would result in her sisters being pulled from their boarding school and brought under his care as well. At 16 and 14, they were even more vulnerable than she was. "I've told him you're unwell," Patrick continued. "Too distraught over your parents' deaths to conduct business. He'll be staying in town, but I've made it clear he's not welcome here again." After he left, securing the bolt behind him, Catherine returned to the window. The stranger Alexander Quinn was mounting his horse, his movements revealing frustration in every line of his body. Just before he rode away, he looked up again at her window. This time, Catherine didn't pull back. Instead, she pressed her palm against the glass, a gesture of desperation she couldn't contain. To her astonishment, he nodded once, decisively, before spurring his horse and galloping away. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She paced the small confines of her prison, her mind filled with possibilities. If Alexander Quinn truly was her father's business partner's son, he might be her only chance at freedom. But even if he suspected something was wrong, what could he do? Her uncle was a prominent rancher with connections throughout the territory. Who would believe his niece was being held prisoner in her own home? The sound of pebbles hitting her window startled her from her thoughts. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the rhythmic pattern continued. Catherine rushed to the window, peering into the darkness. A figure stood in the shadows below, barely visible in the moonlight. When he tilted his head up, she recognized the stranger from earlier that day. Miss O'Sullivan. His voice was low but carried clearly in the night air. "Yes," she whispered back, though she doubted he could hear her through the glass and bars. He must have seen her nod because he continued, "Your uncle claims you're too unwell to come downstairs. Is that true?" Catherine shook her head vehemently, then pressed her fingers against the bars to show her confinement. Even in the dim light, she could see his expression harden. "Are you being held against your will?" she nodded, tears springing to her eyes at finally having someone understand her situation. "I'll return tomorrow night," he promised. "Be ready." Before she could respond, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Catherine trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The next day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Catherine tried to act normally when her Aunt Martha brought her meals, but her nerves were strung tight as piano wire. Martha wasn't unkind, but she was wholly under Patrick's thumb and turned a blind eye to his treatment of Catherine. "Your uncle says that Quinn fellow was asking too many questions in town today," Martha commented as she collected Catherine's lunch tray. "Patrick's worried he might be trying to swindle your father's share of the mine." Catherine kept her expression neutral. "What sort of questions?" "About your parents' deaths. About you." Martha frowned. "Patrick says it's not natural, a man showing such interest in a woman he's never met." "Perhaps he's just being thorough about his father's investment," Catherine suggested, struggling to keep her voice steady. Martha shrugged. "Well, Hank Johnson at the bank told your uncle that this Quinn has been asking about your father's will, too. Patrick's riding out to speak with Sheriff Miller about it now." The news sent a chill through Catherine. If her uncle convinced the sheriff that Alexander Quinn was a threat, any plan for rescue could be ruined before it began. As dusk fell, Catherine packed what few possessions she could into a small satchel, a photograph of her parents and sisters, her mother's locket, a change of clothes. She had no money of her own. Patrick had made sure of that, claiming her female hysteria made her incapable of managing finances. The house grew quiet as the evening progressed. Through her window, Catherine watched the ranch hands retire to their bunkhouse, lights extinguished one by one until only the soft glow of the lamp in her aunt and uncle's bedroom remained visible. When that too went dark, Catherine positioned herself by the window, waiting. Hours passed with no sign of Alexander Quinn. Doubt began to gnaw at her. Had her uncle's visit to the sheriff resulted in Quinn's arrest? Had he simply changed his mind about helping a woman he didn't know? Perhaps it had all been a cruel joke. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a shadow moved across the yard. Catherine's breath caught as Alexander materialized from the darkness, leading his horse quietly toward the house. He carried something over his shoulder, a rope, she realized as he drew closer. With expert precision, he lassoed the gable jutting out near her window. After testing its strength, he began to climb, his movements graceful despite the difficulty of the ascent. Within minutes, he reached her window, his face now level with hers. "Stand back," he whispered. Catherine retreated as he produced a tool from his belt and began working on the bars. The metal groaned softly as he levered them away from the frame, his strong hands making quick work of what had seemed to Catherine an impenetrable barrier. When the bars came free, he set them carefully on the roof beside him, then used his tool to force the window wider. Catherine watched in awe as this stranger dismantled her prison with quiet efficiency. "Can you climb down?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder at the ground below. Catherine hesitated. She'd grown up on a ranch and had once been comfortable with physical challenges, but months of confinement had weakened her. "I'm not sure." Alexander studied her face, then nodded decisively. "I'll carry you down. First, hand me your bag." She passed her small satchel through the window, which he secured to his belt. Then he reached for her, strong arms extending into her prison. Catherine took his hands, gasping slightly at the warmth of human contact after so much isolation. With surprising gentleness, he helped her through the window and onto the narrow ledge beside him. "Hold on to me," he instructed, turning so she could wrap her arms around his neck. Catherine pressed herself against his broad back, breathing in the scent of leather, horse, and something distinctly male. His body was solid and reassuring against hers as he began the descent, one arm securing her while the other managed the rope. When they reached the ground, Alexander didn't set her down immediately. Instead, he turned, adjusting his grip until he was carrying her properly in his arms. "Can you walk?" he whispered, his face close enough that she could see the concern in his eyes, a startling blue even in the darkness. "Yes," Catherine answered, though part of her was reluctant to lose the security of his embrace. "But my uncle has men patrolling the property. We won't make it far on foot." "We're not going on foot," Alexander replied, finally setting her down beside his horse. "This is Titan. He's strong enough to carry us both until we reach my second mount tied up beyond your property line." Catherine stroked the horse's velvet nose. "Hello, Titan," she murmured, finding comfort in the familiar presence of a horse after so long without. Alexander helped her mount, then swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around for the reins. "We'll have to move quickly," he said, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "Your uncle returned from town with 2 deputies. They're staying in the bunkhouse." Fear clutched at Catherine's heart. Deputies? Then the sheriff believed him. "Sheriff Miller owes your uncle money," Alexander explained, urging Titan into a walk, keeping to the shadows of the outbuildings. "And these particular deputies are known to be for hire to whoever pays best. But don't worry, I've faced worse odds." There was something in his voice, a quiet confidence born of experience that reassured Catherine. She leaned back slightly against his solid presence as they made their way toward the edge of the ranch property. They had almost reached the tree line when a shout rang out behind them. "Rider!" By the north pasture, Alexander immediately spurred Titan into a gallop, his arm tightening around Catherine's waist as they raced toward the cover of the trees. Gunshots cracked through the night air, bullets whizzing past them. "Keep low," Alexander commanded, and Catherine pressed herself against the horse's neck, feeling Alexander do the same behind her, his body sheltering hers as much as possible while still maintaining control of their mount. They crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at them as Titan charged forward. Behind them, Catherine could hear the pounding of pursuing horses and more shouts. "There!" Alexander pointed ahead to where another horse was tethered to a tree, already saddled and ready. He pulled Titan to a sliding stop and dismounted in one fluid motion, then reached up to help Catherine down. "Take Titan," he instructed, handing her the reins. "He knows to follow Maverick. I'll create a diversion." Before Catherine could protest, Alexander had drawn his revolver and moved to position himself behind a large boulder. "Go," he urged. "I'll catch up." Catherine hesitated only briefly before mounting Titan again and grabbing the reins of the second horse. With a final glance at Alexander, she urged both horses forward, deeper into the forest. The sound of gunfire erupted behind her, but Catherine didn't look back. She focused on navigating through the trees, trusting Titan to find the path. The second horse, Maverick, seemed to know where they were headed, pulling slightly ahead and guiding their way. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, Catherine heard hoofbeats approaching fast from behind. She tensed, ready to spur Titan to greater speed when Alexander's voice called out, "It's me!" Relief flooded through her as he caught up, taking Maverick's reins from her hand. "Are you hurt?" she asked, scanning him for injuries in the dim moonlight. "Not a scratch," he assured her, though she noticed he held himself somewhat stiffly. "But we need to keep moving. I only bought us a small lead." They rode hard for hours, following game trails and streams to mask their tracks. Alexander led them unerringly through the wilderness, occasionally checking behind them but never slowing their pace. As dawn broke, they emerged from the forest onto a high ridge overlooking a vast valley. "We'll rest the horses here briefly," Alexander decided, dismounting and reaching up to help Catherine down. Her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, muscles unused to such prolonged activity after months of confinement. Alexander caught her before she could fall, his hands strong and steady on her waist. "Sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "Don't apologize." His voice was gentle. "What your uncle did to you, no one should have to endure that." In the growing light, Catherine got her first clear look at her rescuer. Alexander Quinn was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 27 or 28, with features that spoke of both refinement and hardship. His jawline was strong beneath a few days' growth of beard, and those remarkable blue eyes regarded her with concern. "How did you know?" she asked. "That I was being held prisoner." Alexander led her to a fallen log where they could sit while the horses grazed. "I didn't, not at first. I came because my father received a letter from yours shortly before his death, asking for help managing the mine. My father died 3 months ago, and I found the correspondence among his papers." "I'm sorry for your loss," Catherine said softly. He nodded in acknowledgement. "When I arrived and your uncle refused to let me see you, I became suspicious. In town, people spoke of how you'd become a recluse after your parents' deaths, but a few mentioned seeing bars installed on an attic window." His expression hardened. "Then the housekeeper at the hotel. She used to work for your family. Before your uncle let her go, she told me how devoted you were to your sisters. How unlikely it was that you'd voluntarily withdraw from society when they were away at school." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warming morning air. "He threatened to bring my sisters home if I didn't cooperate, said they'd share my fate." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Your uncle will face justice for what he's done." "How?" Catherine asked bitterly. "You said yourself the sheriff is in his pocket." "The territorial marshal isn't," Alexander replied. "I've already sent word to him about my suspicions, but first we need to get you somewhere safe." "Where are we going?" Laramie. "I have friends there, a couple who run a boarding house." "You'll be safe with them while I gather evidence against your uncle." Catherine shook her head. "I won't hide while you put yourself at risk. Patrick won't stop looking for me, and he won't hesitate to hurt anyone who helps me." She met his gaze directly. "Besides, I need to secure my sister's safety and reclaim what's rightfully mine." Alexander studied her for a long moment, respect dawning in his eyes. "Your father told mine you had more spine than most men he knew. I see he wasn't exaggerating." A flush of pleasure warmed Catherine's cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "My father taught me to stand my ground." "A valuable lesson," Alexander agreed, rising to his feet. "We should move on. We've still got a long ride ahead of us." As they continued their journey, Catherine learned more about Alexander Quinn. His father had been a successful businessman with interests in mining throughout the Wyoming Territory. Alexander had been educated in the East, but had returned west 3 years ago when his father's health began to fail. Now, at 28, he was managing their various holdings while also working as a scout for the Army when needed, which explained his tracking and survival skills. "Your uncle didn't recognize my name at first," Alexander told her as they rode side by side along a narrow trail. "But when I mentioned the Silver Creek mine, he became very interested until I asked to speak with you directly." "The mine was my father's pride," Catherine said. "He believed it would secure my sister's futures. But after he and Mother died in that wagon accident, Patrick claimed the mine wasn't producing well." She frowned. "Yet he seemed to have plenty of money for new horses and expanding the ranch house." Alexander's expression grew grim. "According to the records I've seen, the Silver Creek mine has been producing exceptionally well. Your uncle has been pocketing the profits while reporting losses to keep you in the dark." The betrayal stung, though it didn't surprise Catherine. Her uncle had always been greedy, but she hadn't realized the depths of his deception. "How could he do this legally? My father's will left everything to me, with provisions for my sisters." "That's what I intend to find out," Alexander replied. "I suspect your uncle may have falsified documents or coerced someone at the bank or law office. Either way, we'll expose him." As the day wore on, Catherine found herself studying Alexander when he wasn't looking. There was something compelling about him beyond his obvious physical appeal, a sense of integrity that radiated from him like heat from a stove. Despite having only known him for a day, she felt safe in his presence in a way she hadn't since her parents died. By late afternoon, they reached a small homestead nestled against the foothills. A modest cabin with smoke curling from its chimney stood beside a well-maintained barn. "My friend Jacob lives here with his wife, Emma," Alexander explained as they approached. "He served with me during a brief stint I did with the cavalry. They're good people." The door of the cabin opened before they reached it, and a tall man with a shock of sandy hair emerged, rifle ready but held low. "That you, Quinn?" he called. "It's me, Jacob," Alexander confirmed. "I've brought a friend who needs help." Jacob lowered his weapon completely, a broad smile splitting his bearded face. "About time you brought a lady around. Emma's been saying you need a woman's influence." Catherine felt her cheeks warm as Alexander helped her dismount. His hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than necessary, his own face showing a hint of color at his friend's teasing. "It's not like that," he muttered, though something in his tone made Catherine wonder if perhaps he wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. Emma proved to be as welcoming as her husband, ushering Catherine into the cabin and immediately setting about preparing a bath and meal for her. Catherine nearly wept at the simple kindness, realizing how long it had been since anyone had shown genuine concern for her well-being. While Catherine bathed and changed into clean clothes Emma lent her, Alexander conferred with Jacob in low voices near the fireplace. When she emerged, feeling more human than she had in months, they fell silent, both men turning to look at her with expressions that made her self-conscious. "You look better," Alexander said simply, though his eyes conveyed more than his words. Emma bustled forward, linking her arm through Catherine's. Come eat before these men talk your ear off with their planning. You need to regain your strength." The meal was simple but delicious venison stew, freshly baked bread, and apple pie that reminded Catherine painfully of her mother's cooking. As they ate, Alexander explained their situation to Jacob and Emma, who listened with growing outrage. Locking up his own niece, Emma fumed. "I'd like to give that man a piece of my mind and maybe my rolling pin alongside his head." Jacob nodded grimly. "The marshal should hear about this. Barton's a good man, he won't stand for such abuse, regardless of O'Sullivan's standing." "Marshal Barton is in Cheyenne until next week," Alexander replied. "I sent word to him before I went to the O'Sullivan ranch, but we'll need to present him with evidence when he returns." "What sort of evidence?" Catherine asked. "Financial records would be best," Alexander said. "Proof that your uncle has been embezzling from the mine, and the original copy of your father's will, which I suspect is locked away somewhere in your uncle's study." Catherine's heart sank. "So we'd need to go back to the ranch." "I would," Alexander corrected. "You'll stay here where it's safe." "No," Catherine set down her fork with a decisive click. "I told you before I won't hide while you risk yourself. Besides, I know where my father kept important documents. There's a hidden compartment in his desk that Patrick doesn't know about." Alexander opened his mouth to argue, but Jacob cut in. "She's right, Quinn. You'll have a better chance of finding what you need with her help, and trying to sneak onto the property alone would be suicide now that they're on alert." Emma nodded in agreement. "Catherine knows the house and the people there, and from what you've told us about her uncle, he's not likely to stop looking for her anyway. Better to resolve this quickly than leave her in limbo." Alexander looked frustrated but eventually nodded. "We'll need a plan then. We can't just ride up to the front door. The foreman, Lee Wilkins," Catherine said slowly, thinking aloud. "He was loyal to my father and has always been kind to me. He might help us." "Can we trust him?" Alexander asked. Catherine considered this. "I believe so. He's been with our family since before I was born, but Patrick watches him closely, suspicious of his loyalty." "It's a risk," Alexander acknowledged, "but one worth taking if he can get us onto the property undetected." They spent the evening formulating a plan. Jacob would ride into town the next day to send telegrams to Catherine's sister's school in Boston, warning them not to release the girls to anyone but Catherine herself, and to a lawyer friend of Alexander's in Cheyenne, who could begin investigating the legal aspects of the situation. Meanwhile, Catherine and Alexander would approach the O'Sullivan Ranch from the west, where a little used trail wound through a canyon that bordered the property. If they could make contact with Lee without being seen, they might be able to enter the house under cover of darkness and retrieve the documents they needed. "You should get some rest," Alexander told Catherine as Emma prepared a bed for her. "Tomorrow will be challenging." Catherine nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion now that the immediate danger had passed. As Emma led her to the small bedroom off the main living area, she glanced back at Alexander, who was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her fatigue. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." His expression softened. "Get some sleep, Catherine. I'll be here when you wake." That night, Catherine slept more soundly than she had in months, secure in the knowledge that she was finally free of her prison and that Alexander Quinn was keeping watch. Her dreams were a confusing mixture of memories and new impressions: her parents' smiling faces, her sister's laughter, and Alexander's strong arms carrying her to safety. She woke to the sound of voices and the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, disorientation gripped her as she tried to reconcile the unfamiliar surroundings with her recent captivity. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and with them, a surge of determination. When Catherine emerged from the bedroom, she found Alexander and Jacob bent over a rough map spread across the table, deep in discussion. Alexander looked up as she entered, his face brightening in a way that sent a flutter through her stomach. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Emma's just gone to collect eggs. There's coffee if you'd like some." Catherine accepted the mug he offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The simple contact shouldn't have affected her so strongly, but after months of isolation, even such minor touches felt significant. "We've been refining our approach," Jacob explained, indicating the map. "Quinn thinks your best chance is to reach the ranch just after dusk, when the hands will be at supper but before full dark when your uncle might post extra guards." Alexander nodded. "If we can locate Ellie without being seen, he might be able to create a diversion that would draw attention away from the main house." "The cattle in the north pasture," Catherine suggested. "If they were to somehow break through the fence, every available hand would be called to help round them up." Jacob grinned. "I like how you think, Miss O'Sullivan." After breakfast, Jacob saddled his horse to ride into town, carrying the telegrams they'd carefully composed the night before. Before he left, he pulled Alexander aside for a private word, but Catherine caught fragments of their conversation. "Careful, Quinn. I've never seen you look at a woman the way you look at her. Not the time for that kind of talk. Just saying, life's too short to ignore when something special comes along." Alexander's response was too low to hear, but when he rejoined Catherine at the cabin, there was a slight flush to his cheeks that made her wonder exactly what had been said. Emma insisted they wait until mid-afternoon before departing, giving Catherine more time to rest and regain her strength. She also packed them provisions and lent Catherine more suitable clothing for riding, a divided skirt and sturdy blouse that had belonged to her sister. "It suits you," Alexander commented when Catherine emerged in her new attire, his eyes appreciative as they took in her appearance. "It's certainly more practical than what I was wearing before," Catherine replied, feeling oddly shy under his gaze. As they prepared to leave, Emma embraced Catherine warmly. "You're welcome back here anytime, dear. And don't let this one," she jerked her head toward Alexander, "do anything foolishly heroic. Men think they need to solve everything alone." Catherine smiled. "I'll keep him in line." Alexander snorted at that but didn't argue as he helped Catherine mount Titan. With final farewells to Emma, they set off, taking a circuitous route toward the O'Sullivan Ranch to avoid potential patrols Patrick might have sent out looking for them. As they rode, Catherine found herself studying Alexander's profile against the backdrop of the rugged landscape. There was a quiet competence about him that she found immensely attractive, the way he handled his horse, the alert awareness with which he scanned their surroundings, the consideration he showed for her comfort without being patronizing. "You're staring," he commented without looking at her, a hint of amusement in his voice. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks but didn't look away. "I'm trying to understand you." Now he did turn to meet her gaze, one eyebrow raised. "What's to understand?" "Why you're doing all this," she replied honestly. "You could have simply inquired about the mine and left when my uncle was uncooperative. Instead, you risked your life to help a woman you'd never met." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "My father always spoke highly of yours," he finally said. "Said he was one of the few honest men in the mining business. When I realized something was wrong, I couldn't just walk away." He paused, then added more softly, "And when I saw you at that window looking so trapped, something in me couldn't bear it." The simple sincerity in his voice touched Catherine deeply. "Well, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons. Besides," he added with a sudden grin that transformed his serious face, Rescuing beautiful women from towers is what knights are supposed to do, isn't it? Catherine laughed, the sound surprising her with its unfamiliarity after so long without joy. I wasn't aware cowboys considered themselves knights. Some of us have aspirations beyond cattle and horses, Miss O'Sullivan. His eyes twinkled with humor. The easy banter between them continued as they rode, making the journey pass more quickly than Catherine had expected. By late afternoon, they had reached the canyon that marked the western boundary of the O'Sullivan property. Alexander called a halt in a sheltered hollow where a small spring provided water for the horses. "We'll rest here until it's closer to dusk," he decided, helping Catherine dismount. They shared the food. Emma had packed cold chicken, bread, and apples sitting side by side on a fallen log. The domesticity of the moment struck Catherine suddenly, and she wondered what it would be like to share more such moments with Alexander when danger wasn't looming over them. "What will you do?" he asked unexpectedly. "After we've secured your inheritance and ensured your sister's safety?" Catherine considered the question. For so long, her only thought had been escape and survival. The idea of planning for a future felt almost foreign. "I suppose I'll bring my sisters home from school," she said slowly. "Manage the ranch and the mine as my father would have wanted." Alexander nodded. "You'll make an exceptional businesswoman." "What about you?" she asked, curious about his plans. He shrugged, looking out toward the distant mountains. "Continue managing my father's interests, perhaps expand into new territories." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I've been considering investing more heavily in Wyoming." "Oh," Catherine's heart quickened at the implication that he might remain nearby. "It's growing on me," he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities, until Alexander reluctantly stood. "We should prepare to move out. The sun will be setting soon." As they approached the O'Sullivan Ranch from the west, Catherine felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. This land was her birthright, the home where she'd grown up and where her parents were buried. That her uncle had turned it into a prison made her all the more resolved to reclaim it. They left their horses concealed in a grove of trees and proceeded on foot, using the growing shadows to their advantage. The ranch hands would be gathering for their evening meal now, leaving the outlying areas less guarded. "The bunkhouse is there," Catherine whispered, pointing to a long, low building where light and the sound of men's voices spilled from the windows. "And that's Ellie's cabin." She indicated a smaller structure set slightly apart from the others. "How do we signal him without alerting everyone else?" Alexander wondered. Catherine thought for a moment. "The back window of his cabin faces away from the bunkhouse. If we can reach it without being seen, I could tap on the glass. He'll recognize me." Alexander nodded. "I'll cover you." They crept forward, keeping to the shadows cast by outbuildings and corrals. Catherine's heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would give them away, but they reached the rear of Ellie's cabin without incident. Standing on tiptoe, Catherine peered through the window. Ellie sat alone at his table, a plate of food untouched before him as he stared into space, his weathered face drawn with worry. She tapped gently on the glass. Ellie's head snapped up, hand automatically reaching for the revolver at his hip. When he saw Catherine's face, his eyes widened in shock. He moved quickly to the window, unlatching it and pushing it open. "Miss Catherine," he whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Ellie," she confirmed. "I need your help." His gaze darted past her to Alexander, suspicion flaring briefly before returning to her. "Your uncle's been saying you ran off with some fortune hunter. Got the whole county looking for you." "That's not what happened," Catherine said urgently. "Patrick kept me locked in the attic for months. This is Alexander Quinn, son of father's mining partner. He helped me escape." Ellie's expression hardened. "I knew something wasn't right. The missus said the same, that it wasn't like you to hide away, especially from your sister's letters." He studied Alexander. "Quinn, you say? James Quinn's boy?" Alexander nodded. "Yes, sir." "Your father was a good man," Ellie said after a moment. "Come around to the door. Quickly now." Inside the small cabin, Catherine quickly explained their situation and what they needed. "The main house is being guarded," Ellie confirmed grimly. "Patrick's got men posted at all the doors, and that scoundrel Deputy Willis has been staying in the guest room." "We need to create a diversion," Alexander said. "Something big enough to draw everyone's attention, including the deputy." Ellie stroked his chin thoughtfully. "The breeding bulls in the north pasture might do the trick. They're ornery as sin this time of year. If they were to somehow get mixed in with the heifers in the east pasture." "That would certainly require all hands," Catherine agreed. "I can set that in motion," Ellie nodded. "But you'll need a way into the house undetected." "The root cellar," Catherine suggested. "There's an entrance from outside, behind the kitchen garden, and stairs leading up into the pantry." "Patrick had that door boarded up after you escaped," Ellie informed her. "Said he didn't want any more security breaches." Alexander frowned. "Is there another way in?" Ellie considered this. "The old chimney in the library, it hasn't been used in years since the new stove was installed. It's wide enough for a person to climb down, and I happen to know the flue is open because I was supposed to clean it out last week, but never got around to it." "Perfect," Alexander said. "How soon can you arrange the diversion with the cattle?" "Give me 20 minutes to saddle my horse and ride out to the north pasture," Ellie replied. "When you hear the commotion start, that's your signal." As Ellie prepared to leave, he clasped Catherine's hand tightly. "Your father would be proud of your courage, Miss Catherine. And he'd be grateful to you, Mr. Quinn, for helping his daughter." Alexander accepted the compliment with a nod. "It's the right thing to do." Once Ellie had gone, they made their way carefully toward the main house, keeping to the shadows and freezing in place whenever a ranch hand passed nearby. The wait for Ellie's diversion felt interminable, each minute stretching endlessly as they crouched behind a woodpile with a clear view of both the house and the distant pastures. Finally, a commotion erupted from the direction of the north pasture shouts, the bawling of cattle and the thunder of hooves. Lights appeared in the bunkhouse as men rushed out, hastily pulling on boots and grabbing ropes. "That's our cue," Alexander whispered. They ran low to the ground, reaching the base of the massive stone chimney that protruded from the west side of the house. Alexander laced his fingers together to give Catherine a boost, lifting her until she could grasp the rough stones of the chimney. "Can you climb it?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Catherine nodded, already finding handholds in the uneven stonework. "I used to climb trees higher than this before Patrick decided it wasn't ladylike." Alexander chuckled softly. "I'm beginning to think there's nothing you can't do, Miss O'Sullivan." With surprising agility, Catherine scaled the chimney, Alexander following close behind. At the top, she peered down into the dark shaft, thankful that Ellie had been right about the flue being open. "I'll go first," Alexander offered, positioning himself at the edge. "Be careful," Catherine whispered, suddenly afraid for him. "The library should be empty this time of evening, but Patrick sometimes sits there after dinner." Alexander squeezed her hand briefly, then lowered himself into the chimney. Catherine watched anxiously as he disappeared into the darkness, straining to hear any sound that might indicate trouble. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, his whispered voice drifted up to her. "All clear. Come down slowly." The descent through the sooty chimney was more difficult than the climb up had been, but Catherine managed it, feeling Alexander's strong hands at her waist guiding her the final few feet to the hearth. When she was safely down, he helped her step out into the library, both of them now covered in soot. "We look like chimney sweeps," she whispered, brushing ineffectually at her clothes. "It's a good disguise," Alexander replied with a small smile, wiping a smudge from her cheek with his thumb. The gentle touch lingered, his eyes holding hers in the dim light filtering through the curtained windows. The moment was broken by the sound of boots in the hallway outside. They froze, Alexander instinctively placing himself between Catherine and the door. "Damned nuisance," Patrick's voice drifted to them. "Why Wilkins couldn't keep those bulls properly penned is beyond me. Want me to come help round them up?" Another voice, presumably Deputy Willis. "No, stay here," Patrick replied. "I still don't trust that Quinn isn't lurking about." He seemed far too interested in Catherine. The footsteps moved away, and Catherine released the breath she'd been holding. "Father's study is across the hall," she whispered. "We need to hurry before they return." They eased the library door open, checking that the hallway was clear before darting across to the study. Inside, Catherine went directly to her father's massive oak desk, running her fingers along the underside of the right-hand drawer until she felt the small lever concealed there. With a soft click, a panel in the side of the desk slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Catherine reached inside, her fingers closing around a leather portfolio. "Is that it?" Alexander asked softly, keeping watch at the door. "Yes," Catherine confirmed, quickly leafing through the documents inside. "The original will, the deed to the mine, bank records, everything we need." As she tucked the portfolio into her shirt, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Alexander tensed, drawing his revolver. "Quick, behind the curtains," he whispered, gesturing to the heavy drapes framing the window. They had barely concealed themselves when the study door opened and Patrick O'Sullivan entered, followed by Deputy Willis. Catherine held her breath, pressing herself against the wall behind the curtain, acutely aware of Alexander's body shielding hers. "I told you I heard something," Patrick was saying. "Check behind the desk." "There's no one here, O'Sullivan," Willis replied, his voice bored. "Probably just the house settling." "Or mice," Patrick muttered. "This place is falling apart without proper management." "Speaking of which," Willis said, "when do I get the rest of my payment? Keeping your niece's situation quiet isn't cheap." "You'll get your money when I'm sure she's been found," Patrick snapped. "That Quinn fellow is smarter than he looks. I don't trust that he won't try something." "Like breaking into your house," Willis laughed. "Even he wouldn't be that bold." Catherine could feel Alexander's silent chuckle vibrating through his chest where it pressed against her back. The irony wasn't lost on her either, and she had to press her lips together to suppress a nervous giggle. "Just keep your eyes open," Patrick instructed. "I'm going to check on the situation with the cattle. Don't let anyone in or out of this house." After they left, Alexander and Catherine remained hidden for several long minutes, ensuring they were truly gone before emerging from behind the curtains. "We need to leave the way we came," Alexander whispered. "Can you climb back up the chimney?" Catherine nodded, though the prospect wasn't appealing. "With your help." They returned to the library, where Alexander gave Catherine a boost back into the chimney. The ascent was more difficult than the descent had been, the soot making the handhold slippery, but determination drove her upward. When she reached the top, she helped pull Alexander up the final few feet. Outside, the commotion with the cattle was still ongoing, shouts and the occasional gunshot suggesting the situation had escalated beyond a simple roundup. "Elise created quite the diversion," Alexander observed as they carefully made their way down the outer wall of the chimney. He's thorough, Catherine agreed, relieved when her feet finally touched solid ground again. They retraced their steps to Ellie's cabin, where they had arranged to meet him if all went well. The small structure was dark and empty when they arrived, but a note had been left pinned to the door. "Horses in the old line shack. Ride north. We'll find you." Alexander took Catherine's hand as they made their way through the darkness toward the abandoned line shack at the edge of the property. "You did well in there," he told her, his voice low but filled with admiration. "We both did," she replied, squeezing his hand gratefully. "Though I think I'll be washing soot out of my hair for days." His soft laugh warmed her more than it should have, given their precarious situation. There was something about Alexander Quinn that made even danger feel like an adventure rather than a threat. At the line shack, they found their horses saddled and ready, along with fresh supplies, and Catherine was touched to see a small bundle of her personal items that Ellie must have retrieved from her room. They mounted quickly and rode north as instructed, pushing the horses to a gallop once they were safely beyond the boundaries of the ranch. Only when they were several miles away did they slow to a more sustainable pace. "Where are we headed?" Catherine asked, the documents secured against her chest like the precious cargo they were. "There's a small settlement called Clearwater about 20 miles north of here," Alexander replied. "The station master there is an old friend of my father's. He can help us send word to the territorial marshal and keep us safe until he arrives." Catherine nodded, trusting his judgment. As they rode side by side through the moonlit landscape, she found herself stealing glances at his profile, admiring the determination etched in every line of his face. In just 2 days, Alexander Quinn had risked everything to help her, a woman he barely knew, and had shown more integrity and courage than any man she'd ever met. "Thank you," she said suddenly, the words inadequate for what she felt but all she could offer. Alexander turned to her, his expression softening. "For what? For believing me, for helping me, for—" She gestured vaguely at the open land around them, "for giving me back my freedom." His smile in response was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You're worth it, Catherine O'Sullivan." The simple declaration sent warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the exertion of their escape. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Catherine felt something like hope for the future, a future that, increasingly, she found herself wanting Alexander Quinn to be part of. They reached Clearwater just as dawn was breaking, the small cluster of buildings taking shape against the lightening sky. The telegraph office and train station were combined in one modest structure at the edge of town, and it was here that Alexander directed them. The station master, Henry Daniels, was a barrel-chested man with a shock of white hair and keen eyes that missed nothing. He recognized Alexander immediately, engulfing him in a bear hug before turning curious eyes to Catherine. "James Quinn's boy," he boomed. "And who's this lovely lady you've brought to my humble establishment?" After brief introductions and a condensed explanation of their situation, Henry ushered them into his private quarters behind the station, insisting they rest while he sent telegrams to the territorial marshal and to Alexander's lawyer in Cheyenne. "Patrick O'Sullivan won't dare show his face in Clearwater," Henry assured them. "He tried to swindle me out of some property years back. Half the town would string him up if he appeared." Despite her exhaustion, Catherine found it difficult to relax. Every time she closed her eyes, images of their escape flashed through her mind: the climb up the chimney, the tense moments hiding behind the curtains, the midnight ride through unfamiliar territory. Alexander seemed to sense her unease. "You're safe now," he told her, sitting beside her on Henry's worn sofa. "The documents are secure and Marshal Barton will be here within days." "I know," Catherine sighed, It's just hard to believe it's really over." "Not quite over," Alexander corrected gently, "but the worst is behind you. Your uncle will face justice and you'll have your life back." Catherine nodded, then impulsively reached for his hand. "Our fathers would be proud, I think, of how we've honored their partnership." Alexander's fingers curled around hers, warm and reassuring. "I think they would." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, the simple contact sending ripples of awareness through her. "I know I'm glad I found that letter." For several heartbeats, they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then Henry bustled back in with coffee and news breaking the moment. "Telegram sent," he announced cheerfully. "And I've arranged rooms for you both at the Widow Parker's boarding house. Best accommodations in Clearwater, though that's not saying much." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. The territorial marshal, Lucas Barton, arrived with surprising speed, bringing with him a federal prosecutor who took great interest in the documents Catherine had recovered. Alexander's lawyer joined them from Cheyenne, and together they built a case against Patrick O'Sullivan that was, in the prosecutor's words, tight as a drum. Patrick was arrested at the ranch, along with Deputy Willis and the county clerk who had helped falsify records. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had Patrick embezzled funds from the mine, but he had forged Catherine's signature on multiple documents and had bribed officials to look the other way. Through it all, Alexander remained by Catherine's side, offering quiet support and practical assistance that went far beyond his original obligation to investigate his father's partnership. In the evenings, they would walk together through Clearwater's quiet streets, talking about everything and nothing: their childhoods, their hopes for the future, their favorite books and foods and places they'd seen. Catherine found herself falling for him with a speed that would have frightened her had it not felt so right, so natural. There was a depth to Alexander that drew her in an integrity that matched her own, a quiet strength that complemented rather than dominated her independence. On the fourth evening, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Alexander turned to her with unusual seriousness. "What will you do now?" he asked, echoing the question he'd posed days earlier. "Will you return to the ranch?" Catherine nodded slowly. "It's my home. Despite everything that happened there, it's where my roots are, where my parents are buried." She glanced at him. "But first, I need to go to Boston to bring my sisters home. They deserve to know the truth about what happened, and to decide for themselves whether they want to continue their education there or return to Wyoming." "They're lucky to have you," Alexander said softly. "Not many would be so considerate of their wishes." "They're all the family I have left," Catherine replied. "Their happiness matters to me." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of uncertainty she'd never heard from him before. "Would you consider having more family?" Catherine's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I know we've only known each other a short time, but these past days have shown me what kind of woman you are, Catherine O'Sullivan. Brave, intelligent, loyal, and stronger than anyone I've ever met." His blue eyes searched hers intently. "I find myself not wanting to imagine a future without you in it, Alexander." She breathed, barely daring to hope he meant what she thought he did. "I'm not proposing marriage, not yet," he clarified quickly. "That would be presumptuous given how little time we've had together, but I am asking if you might consider allowing me to court you properly. To see if what I feel for you, what I hope you might feel for me, could grow into something lasting." Joy blossomed in Catherine's chest, warm and bright as the setting sun. "I would like that very much," she whispered. His smile was radiant as he raised one hand to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Catherine O'Sullivan?" In answer, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers with gentle reverence, the kiss sweet and unhurried, a promise of things to come rather than a demand. Catherine's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself against the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. When they parted, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "I'll accompany you to Boston," he offered, "if you'd like the company. I have business interests there that could use attention and, Catherine prompted when he hesitated. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "And I'm not quite ready to let you out of my sight just yet," Catherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'd welcome the company. The journey is long, and I've grown rather accustomed to having you nearby." "It's settled then," he said, pressing another quick kiss to her lips before settling back in his chair, though he kept her hand firmly in his. "We'll leave for Boston as soon as the legal matters here are resolved." 2 weeks later, Catherine stood on the platform of the Cheyenne train station, watching as Alexander secured their luggage with the porter. The past fortnight had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, paperwork, and preparations, but now Patrick was in custody awaiting trial. The mine and ranch were legally restored to Catherine's ownership. Annalie had been appointed temporary foreman to oversee operations until her return. "Ready for another adventure?" Alexander asked, rejoining her and offering his arm. Catherine slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, smiling up at him. "With you, always." As the train pulled away from the station, Catherine watched the Wyoming landscape scroll past the window, thinking of all that had happened since that day Alexander had first appeared at the ranch. Her uncle's betrayal had nearly cost her everything, but it had also brought Alexander Quinn into her life, a man who had broken down her prison door and carried her not just to safety, but toward a future brighter than she could have imagined. The journey to Boston was long but comfortable, made more so by Alexander's constant attentiveness. They shared a private compartment during the day, Alexander reading aloud from novels he'd purchased for the trip, while Catherine worked on letters to her sisters, preparing them for her arrival. At night, Catherine retired to a separate sleeping compartment, though sometimes she found herself lying awake, thinking of Alexander just a thin wall away and wondering what their future might hold. By the time they reached Boston, their courtship had progressed from tentative to certain. Each day revealed new facets of Alexander's character that Catherine admired: his patience with delays, his kindness to fellow travelers, his intelligent observations about the changing landscape and communities they passed through. In turn, he seemed endlessly fascinated by her thoughts and opinions, encouraging her to speak her mind even when her views differed from his own. The reunion with her sisters, Elizabeth and Charlotte, was tearful and joyous. At 16 and 14, they had grown in the months since Catherine had last seen them, but their fierce hugs and rapid-fire questions were wonderfully familiar. They took to Alexander immediately, especially when he presented them with carefully chosen gifts: a beautifully bound journal for Elizabeth, who aspired to be a writer, and a small but professional set of watercolors for Charlotte, whose artistic talents had been evident from an early age. "Is he your beau?" Charlotte whispered to Catherine as they prepared for bed their first night in Boston, her young face alight with romantic notions. Catherine smiled, glancing toward the door that separated their hotel suite from Alexander's adjoining room. "He's a very special friend," she answered diplomatically. "We're getting to know each other better. He looks at you the way father used to look at mother," Elizabeth observed with the perception of a natural storyteller, "like you're the sun and moon and stars all wrapped up in one person." The observation warmed Catherine's heart. She hadn't been sure if her sisters would remember such details about their parents, who had been demonstratively affectionate throughout their marriage. "Does he make you happy?" Elizabeth asked, more seriously. "Very much so," Catherine replied honestly. "Then I approve," her sister said with mock solemnity, making them all laugh. The next few weeks were spent closing out the girls' affairs at their boarding school, shopping for necessities for the return journey, and introducing Alexander to Boston society through connections his father had maintained. Catherine watched with pride as he navigated these social waters with ease, his Western directness tempered by an innate courtesy that charmed even the stuffiest Boston matrons. It was during a quiet dinner, just the two of them at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor, that Alexander finally broached the subject they had been circling for weeks. "I've been thinking about our return to Wyoming," he began, setting down his wine glass. "About the future." Catherine's pulse quickened. "Oh, I've received an offer to purchase my shares in the Colorado mining operation," he continued, "at a very favorable price. If I accept, I could reinvest the capital in Wyoming, specifically in expanding operations at Silver Creek." "That sounds like a sound business decision," Catherine replied, though she sensed there was more to his thoughts than mere financial considerations. Alexander reached across the table for her hand. "It would mean relocating permanently to Wyoming, building a home there." His eyes held hers steadily. "Perhaps building a life there with you if you'd have me." Though she had anticipated this moment, the reality of it still took Catherine's breath away. "Alexander, are you proposing?" "I am," he confirmed, his expression serious yet tender. "I love you, Catherine O'Sullivan. These past weeks have only confirmed what I suspected from the moment I carried you out of that house, that you are the woman I want to spend my life with. You're strong, intelligent, and kind, with a spirit that amazes me daily." He squeezed her hand gently. "I don't want to pressure you, and I understand if you need time to consider." "Yes," Catherine interrupted, tears of joy blurring her vision. "Yes, I will marry you, Alexander Quinn." His face broke into a radiant smile as he rose from his chair, coming around the table to kneel beside her, heedless of the other diners watching with interest. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring with a brilliant diamond flanked by smaller sapphires. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father said she chose it because the sapphires reminded her of the Wyoming sky." "It's beautiful," Catherine whispered, admiring how it caught the light. "Perfect." Alexander raised her hand to his lips, kissing the ring that now symbolized their commitment, just like its new owner. The other patrons in the restaurant broke into spontaneous applause, making Catherine blush and Alexander grin as he returned to his seat, never releasing her hand across the table. "Your sisters will be pleased," he commented, his eyes twinkling. "Charlotte has been dropping rather unsubtle hints about wedding plans for the past week," Catherine laughed. "You noticed that too, and here I thought she was being discreet." "About as discreet as a stampeding buffalo," Alexander chuckled. "Though Elizabeth is more reserved, I caught her watching us yesterday with that writer's look, the one where she's mentally composing dialogue." "Those two," Catherine shook her head fondly. "They'll be ecstatic. They adore you already." "The feeling is mutual," Alexander assured her. "They're remarkable young women. You've done an admirable job looking after them." "We'll continue together," Catherine said, the thought filling her with warmth. "They need a man in their lives not to control them but to support them, as my father did." "I would be honored," Alexander replied seriously. "Though I suspect they'll be teaching me a thing or two, rather than the other way around." The remainder of their time in Boston took on a celebratory air once the engagement was announced. Catherine's sisters were indeed thrilled, Charlotte immediately launching into elaborate wedding plans while Elizabeth began composing what she called an epic romance based on true events. Alexander's business associates in Boston hosted a small engagement dinner, and Catherine was touched by how genuinely pleased they seemed about the match. One elderly gentleman who had known Alexander's father for decades took Catherine aside during the evening to tell her James would have approved wholeheartedly. He always hoped his son would find a woman with both spirit and sense. As the day of their departure approached, Catherine found herself eager to return to Wyoming to begin this new chapter of her life. The ranch that had briefly been her prison now represented opportunity, a place where she and Alexander could build something meaningful together, where her sisters could grow into the remarkable women they were destined to become. The return journey west felt entirely different from their trip east. Where before there had been uncertainty and the lingering shadow of Patrick's betrayal, now there was anticipation and joy. The four of them, Catherine, Alexander, Elizabeth, and Charlotte, shared stories, played cards, and made plans for the future as the train carried them across the vast American landscape. "When will the wedding be?" Charlotte asked eagerly as they crossed into Wyoming territory, the familiar rugged terrain visible through the windows. Catherine exchanged a glance with Alexander. "We thought perhaps next month," she replied. "A small ceremony at the ranch, once we've had time to settle in and make some improvements to the house. Just family and close friends," Alexander added, "though I expect half the county will find a reason to stop by afterward. Will I get to wear a new dress?" Charlotte wanted to know, practical concerns foremost in her 14-year-old mind. "Both of you will have new dresses," Catherine promised, "and you'll stand up with me during the ceremony." Elizabeth, who had been quietly contemplating the landscape, turned to Alexander. "Will you live at the ranch with us? Or will Catherine move to your home?" "I thought we might build something new," Alexander replied, including Catherine in his glance to confirm this was still their plan. "On the ridge overlooking both the ranch house and the valley, where we can see all the way to the Silver Creek mine on clear days." "Our own home," Catherine affirmed, "but close enough that we can oversee both the ranch and the mine, and close enough that you girls can come and go as you please." This seemed to satisfy Elizabeth, who nodded thoughtfully before returning to her observation of the passing scenery. When they finally arrived at the small station nearest the O'Sullivan Ranch, Eli was waiting with the wagon, his weathered face breaking into a broad smile at the sight of them. "Miss Catherine, and the young Mrs. too," he exclaimed, helping them down from the train. He tipped his hat to Alexander. "Mr. Quinn, good to see you again under better circumstances." The ride to the ranch was filled with Eli's updates on the property and the mine. With Patrick in custody and awaiting trial, the atmosphere among the ranch hands had improved considerably. Most had never approved of Patrick's treatment of Catherine, but had been powerless to intervene without risking their livelihoods. "The men are eager to meet the new boss," Eli told Alexander with a knowing wink. "Word spreads fast in these parts. Catherine is the boss," Alexander corrected mildly. "I'm just the fortunate man she's agreed to marry." Eli's eyebrows shot up in surprise before his face settled into a pleased expression. "Well now, that's the best news I've heard in a long while. Congratulations to you both." As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Catherine felt a surge of complex emotions. This land represented both pain and promise, the site of her imprisonment, but also her heritage and future. Alexander's hand found hers in the back of the wagon, squeezing gently as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. "Welcome home," he murmured for her ears alone. The month leading up to their wedding passed in a flurry of activity. The attic room where Catherine had been imprisoned was dismantled, the bars removed from the window, and the space converted into a bright studio for Charlotte's artistic pursuits. Alexander moved into the foreman's cabin temporarily, coming to the main house each day to help with improvements and to join the family for meals. True to their plan, construction began on a new home on the ridge overlooking the valley. Alexander worked alongside the builders, often returning to the ranch covered in sawdust and sporting minor injuries that Catherine tended with affectionate exasperation. "You don't have to build it with your own hands," she told him one evening as she bandaged a particularly nasty splinter wound. "That's why we hired professionals. I want to be able to tell our children that their father helped build their home," he replied, his expression so earnest that Catherine couldn't help but lean forward and kiss him. "Our children," she repeated softly, the phrase filling her with a warm glow. "I like the sound of that." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the October sky a perfect Wyoming blue that matched the sapphires in Catherine's engagement ring. The ceremony was held in the ranch's newly renovated garden, where Catherine's mother had once tended roses and wildflowers. Elizabeth and Charlotte had restored it over the past weeks, filling it with autumn blooms and colorful foliage. Catherine wore a gown of ivory silk ordered from Denver, simpler than Boston fashion dictated but perfect for a Wyoming bride. Her sisters had woven wildflowers into her copper hair, and as she walked toward Alexander, who waited beneath an arch of twisted willow branches, she had never felt more beautiful or more certain of her path. The territorial judge who performed the ceremony spoke of partnership and mutual respect, of building a life founded on love and trust. As Catherine and Alexander exchanged vows and rings, she thought of how far they had come from that first desperate meeting at her attic window. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge concluded, beaming at the couple before him. "Mr. Quinn, you may kiss your bride." Alexander's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of all that was to come. When they turned to face their guests, a gathering that included not only ranch hands and miners, but also businessmen from Cheyenne, the territorial marshal, and even Henry Daniels from Clearwater, the cheers were deafening. The celebration lasted well into the night, with food and dancing and more than a few emotional toasts. As dusk fell, Alexander led Catherine away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley, where they could see the foundation of their new home taking shape on the distant ridge. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they gazed at the view. "Incredibly so," Catherine replied, leaning back against his chest, "though I'm still getting used to the name." "Catherine Quinn," he murmured against her hair. "It suits you." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "A year ago, I never could have imagined being here like this. After my parents died, I thought my life was over." "And now," Alexander prompted gently. "Now I know it was just beginning," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky. 5 years later, Catherine stood on the porch of their ridge-top home, watching as Alexander taught their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted laughter carried on the summer breeze, matched by the giggle of his 1-year-old sister, Margaret, who sat on a blanket at Catherine's feet, playing with wooden blocks. The years had brought both challenges and joys. Patrick had been convicted and imprisoned for his crimes. The Silver Creek mine had prospered under their joint management, and the ranch had expanded its operations. Elizabeth, now 21, had published her first novel, a somewhat romanticized account of Catherine and Alexander's meeting and courtship that had become quite popular in Eastern literary circles. Charlotte, at 19, was studying art in Denver, her talent having secured her a place with a renowned teacher. Catherine's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where their third child was just beginning to show. Alexander didn't know yet she was saving the news for that evening, when they would celebrate their anniversary with a private dinner after the children were asleep. As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander looked up from his lesson with James, his smile as warm and loving as it had been on the day he'd first carried her from her prison. He whispered something to their son, who nodded eagerly, and then they both waved to Catherine. "Mama," James called. "Papa says I'm the best rider he's ever seen." "Better than your old man already," Alexander confirmed, ruffling the boy's dark hair, so like his own. Catherine waved back, her heart full to bursting with love for her family. The journey from that locked attic room to this moment had been extraordinary, a path from imprisonment to freedom, from isolation to connection, from fear to love. As she watched her husband swing their son up into his strong arms and start toward the house, their daughter clapping with excitement at their approach, Catherine silently thanked whatever fate or providence had sent Alexander Quinn to her window that night. He had indeed broken down her door and carried her out not just to safety, but to a life more beautiful and fulfilling than she could ever have dreamed.